Are you actually laughing at me, Mr. Ryu? Zuri asked, her voice perfectly steady as she stared down the most dangerous, broad-shouldered billionaire in Seoul. The terrifying underworld boss had just mocked her age, her intricate African braids, and her audacity for walking into his private executive boardroom uninvited. But the cold, arrogant smirk completely vanished from his face the second she casually slid a red, encrypted flash drive across his massive mahogany desk. He thought she was just a naive Gen Z digital analyst he could easily intimidate and discard, completely unaware that she had just single-handedly dismantled a massive corporate coup meant to destroy him, and right now, she was the only person on Earth holding the keys to his entire empire. Welcome to Annie's Empire of Love, where power meets vulnerability, and silence holds the deepest secrets. Today, you'll witness a man the world fears, and a woman who refuses to be broken. This isn't just romance. It's loyalty. It's hidden strength. It's a love born inside an empire of secrets. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, so find your quiet place, dim the lights, and get ready. Because in Annie's empire, love is the only law worth breaking. Let's begin. The penthouse boardroom of Ryu Holdings was a freezing, sterile cathedral of glass and black steel, suspended 100 floors above the bustling streets of Seoul. It was an environment designed to make powerful men feel small, but 23-year-old Zuri Washington did not feel small. She stood at the opposite end of the massive mahogany table, her posture flawless. Her intricate African braids were styled into an elegant, commanding updo that completely defied the rigid, conservative dress code of the corporate elite. She was curvy, vibrant, and undeniably beautiful, wearing a perfectly tailored emerald green suit that demanded attention in a room entirely devoid of color. At the head of the table sat Ryu Ji-hoo. He was a man who ruled through terrifying silence and boundless wealth. Broad-shouldered and impossibly handsome, he wore a bespoke charcoal suit that looked more like armor than corporate attire. As the rumored head of the city's most untouchable syndicate, he didn't need to raise his voice or break fingers to destroy his enemies. A single stroke of his pen could bankrupt a rival dynasty. His dark, calculating eyes were currently fixed on Zuri, with a mixture of profound annoyance and icy amusement. Let me ensure I understand this correctly. Ji-hoo's voice finally broke the suffocating silence. It was a deep, resonant baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down Zuri's spine, though she expertly hid it. A junior data analyst from the sub-basement department bypassed 3 levels of executive security, interrupted my private strategy meeting, and demands a direct audience with me. He leaned back in his leather chair, a cold, mocking smirk touching the corner of his mouth. You look like you should be filming a TikTok dance, Miss Washington, not standing in my boardroom. I could have you blacklisted from every tech firm in Asia before you even reach the elevator. Zuri didn't flinch. She didn't lower her eyes, nor did she apologize. Instead, she took slow, deliberate steps toward the head of the table, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. The sheer, unbothered confidence radiating from her made Ji-hoo's eyes narrow. He was entirely unaccustomed to women or men, for that matter looking at him without an ounce of fear. Are you actually laughing at me, Mr. Ryu? Zuri asked, her voice perfectly steady, replacing his cold mockery with a sharp, intellectual dominance. She reached the edge of his desk and casually dropped a small, crimson flash drive onto the immaculate mahogany surface. It slid across the wood, stopping exactly an inch from his expensive silver pen. Ji-hoo stared at the drive, his smirk vanishing. What is this? That is a heavily encrypted ledger, Zuri stated calmly, crossing her arms over her chest. While your executive security was busy making sure nobody brought unauthorized coffee onto this floor, I was tracking an invisible data hemorrhage in your offshore accounts. 3 of your most trusted board members aren't just embezzling funds, Mr. Ryu. They've initiated a hostile corporate coup that will legally strip you of your title and your company by BWKM tomorrow. Ji-hoo went completely still. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The terrifying Iron Boss leaned forward, his predatory gaze locking onto her. He tried to crush her with the sheer weight of his presence, looking for the lie, the hesitation, the weakness. He found absolutely none. Her warm, intelligent brown eyes held his dark stare with a power he had never encountered before. "If this is a joke," Jihu whispered, his voice dangerously low, "it will be the last one you ever make." "It's not a joke. And neither is my firewall," Zuri replied smoothly, offering him a sweet, devastating smile. "I already initiated a counter-protocol. I locked the traders out of the mainframe, froze their ghost accounts, and secured your controlling shares." Jihu's eyes widened slightly in sheer disbelief. "You breached my own servers?" "I did," Zuri said, leaning in just slightly, her voice dropping to a low, breathless challenge. "But the lockdown expires in exactly 3 hours. The entire system will automatically hand your empire over to the traders, unless you ask me nicely for the password." By 9 a.m. the following morning, Zuri Washington was no longer a ghost in the sub-basement IT department. With a single, unspoken directive from the top, her entire life was uprooted. She was relocated to the 100th floor, positioned at a sleek, minimalist workstation situated directly outside Ryu Jihu's private office. The executive floor was an intimidating fortress of silence. The walls were constructed of heavy, one-way mirrored glass. From the outside, it looked like a flawless, impenetrable obsidian mirror, but from the inside, Jihu had an uninterrupted view of everything. Especially her. Jihu sat in his high-backed leather chair, completely ignoring the multi-billion-won international market reports glowing on his monitors. Instead, his pitch-black, predatory eyes were locked onto the glass. He was a man who ruled through absolute observation. In his empire, information was the ultimate currency, and silence was the ultimate weapon. For 32 years, he had operated as the apex predator of Seoul because he could read people within seconds. He knew their greed, their fears, and their price. But Zuri was a riddle he couldn't solve. Through the glass, he watched her work. She sat gracefully, her voluptuous curves beautifully filling out a sharp, tailored lavender blazer that provided a stunning, defiant splash of color against his monochrome corporate kingdom. Her intricate African braids cascaded over her shoulders, swaying rhythmically whenever she tilted her head to analyze a complex stream of data on her screens. She didn't look stressed. She didn't look like a woman who had just hijacked a billionaire's mainframe to save his life. She looked entirely, devastatingly in control. Jihu found his gaze dropping to her hands. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with a mesmerizing, lightning-fast precision. He zoomed in on his private security camera feed, his jaw clenching as he noticed a tiny detail. She was casually chewing on a strawberry lollipop, a faint, amused smile playing on her lips as she outmaneuvered his multi-million-dollar cybersecurity protocols. She isn't afraid of me, Jihu realized, a dangerous, unfamiliar thrill coiling deep in his chest. She knows I am watching, and she is entirely unbothered. He tried to force himself to look away. He was a corporate monarch, the undisputed king of an underworld syndicate that could make entire industries collapse overnight. He didn't hit people, he bought out their livelihoods and canceled their existences with a single phone call. He was supposed to be analyzing her as a potential liability, a threat to be neutralized or permanently silenced through corporate blacklisting. Yet, every time he looked at her, his cold, calculating mind short-circuited. He wasn't thinking about data breaches. He was thinking about the smooth, rich tone of her skin, the sharp brilliance of her eyes, and the sheer audacity it took to stand in his boardroom and demand he ask her nicely. Outside the glass, Zuri could feel the crushing weight of his presence. The air on the 100th floor was heavy, suffocatingly dense with the raw energy of his silent watch. She didn't need to see through the mirrored glass to know those pitch-black eyes were tracing her every move. The sheer power gap between them was immense. He owned the building, the city's infrastructure, and practically the ground she walked on. But Zuri refused to be intimidated by his wealth or his terrifying reputation. She knew that men like Ryu Jihu were used to people bowing until their foreheads hit the floor. They fed on fear. Slowly, deliberately, Zuri stopped typing. She spun her sleek leather chair around, facing the one-way mirrored glass directly. She leaned back, crossing her legs, and looked straight into the exact spot where she knew he was sitting. She slowly took the strawberry lollipop out of her mouth, raised an eyebrow, and gave the mirror a knowing, highly confident smirk. Inside the office, Jiho's breath caught in his throat. It was a bold psychological power move. She couldn't see him, yet she was looking right through him. Unable to tolerate the distance any longer, Jiho stood up. His broad shoulders squared as he adjusted his custom charcoal suit jacket. He walked to the heavy mahogany door, gripping the handle, and stepped out onto the executive floor. The sudden click of his door opening made the surrounding security detail instantly snap to attention, their bodies rigid with fear. Jiho ignored them, walking directly toward Zuri's desk with slow, measured, and deeply intimidating steps. He towered over her, his massive frame completely blocking out the morning sunlight filtering through the panoramic windows. The silence that followed his approach was deafening. "Is my workspace to your satisfaction, Miss Washington?" Jiho inquired, his deep rumbling baritone slipping into a low velvet timbre that echoed with absolute authority. Zuri didn't look down at his expensive leather shoes. She slowly tilted her head back, her warm brown eyes meeting his cold obsidian stare without a single tremor of hesitation. She let her gaze linger on his sharp, aristocratic features, acknowledging his devastating good looks before returning to his eyes. "The desk is fine, Mr. Ryu," Zuri replied smoothly, her voice carrying an emotionally dominant edge that completely threw his security team into silent panic. "Though, if you wanted to look at me this badly, you could have just invited me in for coffee. It saves you the trouble of staring through a mirror all morning." A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the hallway. No one, absolutely no one, spoke to the Iron Boss with such casual defiance. Jiho's eyes narrowed, a dark, dangerous storm brewing within them. He leaned forward, placing both of his large hands on the edge of her desk, trapping her within his immediate personal space. The scent of him, rich cedarwood, expensive amber, and raw, absolute power instantly surrounded her. "You have a very dangerous tongue, Miss Washington," Jiho whispered, his voice dropping an octave, meant only for her ears. "You think because you hold the password to my mainframe, you are safe from my reach. You forget that with a single phone call, I can ensure you never find employment, housing, or peace in this country again. I can erase your digital existence entirely." It was a massive social power move, a reminder of the vast, terrifying gap between a billionaire king and a young data analyst. Zuri leaned in slightly, bringing her face mere inches from his. The proximity was overwhelming, the romantic and psychological tension snapping between them like static electricity. She looked at his lips, then back to his cold eyes, utterly refusing to back down. "You could do that, Mr. Ryu," Zuri murmured, her voice a calm, intellectual caress. "But you won't, because an elite predator doesn't destroy the only person capable of saving his life. You need my mind to survive tomorrow morning. And more importantly," she paused, her voice taking on a deeply addictive, slow-burn confidence, "you're far too fascinated by me to let me go." Jiho's heart hammered violently against his ribs. The raw, honest truth of her words sliced right through his cold armor. She had read him completely. She had tamed his intimidation tactic using nothing but her mind and her absolute lack of fear. A slow, utterly wicked, and breathlessly intense realization washed over the terrifying mafia boss. His cold exterior didn't just crack, it began to melt. He straightened up slowly, his eyes locking onto hers with a dark, deeply possessive intensity that promised a completely different kind of danger. He reached down, his large, calloused fingers deliberately brushing against her laptop keyboard, terminating her access to the public corporate server with a single keystroke. Jiho leaned back in just a fraction, delivering a shocking verbal grenade that left Zuri's breath completely trapped in her chest. "You are entirely correct, Zuri," Jiho purred, using her first name for the absolute first time, his voice laced with an undeniable, intoxicating possessiveness. "Which is why I just bought out your entire employment contract from the board. From this moment on, you don't work for Ryu Holdings anymore." You belong exclusively to my private estate, and your lockdown password is no longer your leverage, it's your permanent residence. The Ryu estate, hidden deep within the exclusive hills of Seongbuk-dong, was less of a home and more of an architectural fortress of glass, black marble, and terrifying silence. When Zuri stepped out of the blacked-out Maybach, she had fully expected to be escorted to a sterile guest room or an underground server farm. Instead, Ji-hoo's silent, white-gloved staff led her to the east wing of the estate, opening the double mahogany doors to a sprawling, multi-million-won luxury suite. The room was breathtaking, but it was the terrifying attention to detail that made Zuri's breath catch in her throat. Set against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Seoul skyline was a custom, state-of-the-art multi-monitor workstation. Resting on the desk was the exact ergonomic chair she had requested and been denied by at HR 3 months ago. Next to the keyboard sat a crystal bowl filled entirely with her favorite strawberry lollipops and a steaming cup of the highly specific, imported herbal tea she drank every morning. Ryuji, who hadn't just moved her, he had studied her. He had catalogued her preferences with the precision of a predator, learning the exact habits of a creature he intended to keep. By 2:00 a.m., the suffocating luxury of the golden cage made it impossible to sleep. The lockdown on the Ryu Holdings mainframe was set to expire in exactly 6 hours. Millions of dollars, corporate legacies, and the ultimate fate of the Iron Boss were ticking down on a digital clock. Unable to sit still, Zuri tightened the belt of her silk emerald robe, a garment provided in her closet that perfectly matched the suit she had worn earlier, and stepped out into the cavernous, dimly lit hallways of the estate. The house was entirely silent, devoid of the bustling security presence she expected. She found him in the central library. The room was a massive, 2-story vault of literature, smelling of old paper and rich cedar wood. Ji-hoo was standing by a massive oak table, bathed in the faint, cool glow of a single desk lamp. The terrifying, immaculate corporate monarch was completely stripped of his armor. His charcoal suit jacket was draped carelessly over a chair. His crisp white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the silk tie discarded on the floor, and his sleeves were rolled up, revealing thick, muscular forearms corded with tension. He was staring down at a sprawling array of physical, handwritten ledgers and architectural blueprints. He didn't look like the ruthless underworld king who snapped corporate dynasties in half. In the quiet shadows of the library, Ryu Ji-hoo looked profoundly, agonizingly exhausted. Zuri didn't retreat into the shadows. Her emotional dominance refused to let her tiptoe around any man, no matter how much wealth he possessed. She crossed the threshold, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug. "You can't solve a digital coup with physical ink, Mr. Ryu," Zuri said softly, breaking the absolute silence of the room. Ji-hoo didn't flinch, nor did he look up immediately. He slowly closed his eyes, his broad shoulders rising and falling with a heavy, ragged sigh. When he finally opened them and turned to face her, the cold, predatory mask he wore for the world was entirely fractured. His pitch-black eyes were heavily shadowed with fatigue, swirling with a raw, unprotected vulnerability that he had never allowed another human being to witness. "I am not trying to solve the coup, Zuri," Ji-hoo murmured, his deep baritone completely devoid of its usual terrifying edge. It was soft, rumbling, and devastatingly honest. "I am trying to calculate what will be lost when the board takes control." Zuri walked slowly toward the table, her intricate African braids catching the dim light. She stopped right beside him, close enough to feel the intense, radiating heat of his large body. She looked down at the blueprints scattered across the oak wood. They weren't corporate expansion plans or offshore shell company structures. They were blueprints for a massive, fully funded smart city infrastructure project aimed at Seoul's most impoverished, forgotten districts. There were plans for free automated clinics, subsidized housing towers, and state-of-the-art community tech centers. Zuri's eyes widened in profound realization. The offshore accounts, the millions of won the board accused you of hoarding. I wasn't hoarding it. Ji-hoo confessed quietly, leaning his heavy frame against the edge of the table. He looked at her, his eyes stripping away the last remnants of his Iron Boss persona. The board wanted to use our third quarter profits to illegally fund a massive political lobbying ring to deregulate data privacy laws. I blocked them. I diverted the capital here to build something that actually matters. But in my world, Zuri, philanthropy is viewed as weakness. If they knew I cared about the lower districts, they would have targeted the people there to get to me. He ran a weary hand through his perfectly styled dark hair, ruining it entirely. I built a reputation of absolute, ruthless terror just to keep the monsters out of my garden. The first, monumental crack in the Iron Boss's soul was entirely visible. He wasn't a cold-blooded tyrant. He was a deeply isolated king, bearing the crushing weight of a secret war, carrying it all entirely alone. Zuri's chest tightened with an unexpected, fierce surge of empathy. The psychological tension between them shifted dramatically, from a power struggle to a profound, intimate understanding. She didn't use this moment to leverage her password. She didn't gloat. Instead, she took a deliberate step into his immediate personal space. They fear you because they cannot control your mind. Jihu, Zuri whispered gently, dropping his formal title entirely. It was a massive social power move, but this time it was laced with deep comfort rather than defiance. She reached out. Her warm, melanin-rich hand hovered over the blueprint for a second, before she gently placed her palm flat over his large, calloused hand that was resting on the table. Jihu's breath hitched sharply in his chest. The contact was electric, a sudden jolt of warmth slicing straight through decades of freezing isolation. He looked down at her small hand resting over his, and then up into her brilliant, expressive brown eyes. He didn't pull away. He couldn't. He stared at her as if she were the only source of oxygen in the room. You don't have to carry the entire empire by yourself tonight, Zuri murmured, her voice a soothing, highly addictive balm to his frayed nerves. You have my firewall. The traitors are locked out. Right now, you just need to rest. For a long, breathlessly intense moment, the terrifying mafia boss completely melted. He leaned into her touch, his thumb subconsciously twitching to stroke the side of her hand. The slow burn romantic tension was agonizingly thick, suspended in the quiet air of the library. Zuri offered him a soft, reassuring smile, slowly withdrawing her hand to let him breathe. Get some sleep, Jihu. I will enter the decryption password at 7:59 am. Your garden is safe. She turned around, the silk of her robe whispering against the floor as she headed toward the mahogany doors. Zuri, his voice stopped her dead in her tracks. It wasn't the soft, vulnerable whisper from a moment ago. The absolute, chilling authority had returned, but it was laced with a dark, protective urgency. Zuri turned back around. Jihu was standing at his full, intimidating height, his obsidian eyes completely unreadable. You don't need to enter the password tomorrow morning, Jihu stated, his gaze locking onto hers. Zuri frowned, deep confusion flashing across her beautiful features. What do you mean? If I don't enter the password, the system resets, and the board legally seizes your accounts. I didn't bring you to this estate to unlock the mainframe, Jihu whispered, taking a slow, predatory step toward her, dropping a verbal grenade that shattered the entire foundation of the night. I brought you here because the embezzled offshore accounts you froze, the board didn't put them in my name. They registered the shell companies entirely under yours. Zuri's blood ran completely cold. Tomorrow morning, the board isn't executing a corporate takeover against me, Jihu finished, his jaw clenching with lethal, protective fury. They are executing a federal frame-up against you. The suffocating silence of the library pressed down on them like a physical weight. The words echoed in Zuri's mind, sharp and catastrophic. They are executing a federal frame-up against you. For a terrifying moment, the entire world stopped spinning. Zuri's brilliant, analytical mind raced through the implications. If the mainframe lockdown expired, the board wouldn't just take Jihu's company. Federal prosecutors would immediately trace the frozen billions directly to the ghost accounts registered under her name. She was a junior data analyst with zero corporate backing and no high-powered legal team. She was the perfect, invisible fall guy. By 8:01 am, she would be facing decades in a federal penitentiary for the largest corporate embezzlement in South Korean history. But Zuri Washington was not built to shatter. Instead of panic, a cold, hyper-focused clarity washed over her. She didn't cry. She didn't beg the Iron Boss to save her. She slowly withdrew her hand from his, her posture snapping perfectly straight as she looked at the blueprints on the table. They needed a ghost, Zuri concluded, her voice a calm, lethal whisper that sent a jolt of pure admiration straight down Ji-hoo's spine. An unattached, low-level employee with enough network clearance to make the data trail look plausible, but entirely lacking the social power to fight back in court. Ji-hoo watched her, completely mesmerized. Any other person would have collapsed in sheer terror. But his beautiful, brilliant analyst was already deconstructing the trap. Exactly, Ji-hoo confirmed, his deep baritone rumbling with a dark, protective fury. The moment you step off this estate, the board's private security will intercept you. They will hand you over to the authorities before you can even make a phone call. He stepped closer, closing the distance until the rich scent of his cedarwood cologne completely enveloped her. He reached into the inner pocket of his discarded charcoal suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavily embossed leather folder. He placed it deliberately on the oak table, right over the blueprints. "Which is why you are not leaving," Ji-hoo stated, his pitch-black eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the air in the room feel dangerously thin. Zuri looked down at the folder. "What is that?" "It is a legally binding, ironclad corporate contract," Ji-hoo explained, his voice dropping to a smooth, hypnotic cadence. "I had my personal legal team draft it the second I realized the board was using your name. If you sign that document, you cease to be a junior data analyst. You immediately become the executive director of intelligence for Ryu Holdings, answering to absolutely no one but me. You will be granted ultimate diplomatic and corporate immunity, backed by the full, terrifying weight of my syndicate." Zuri's breath hitched. It was a massive social power move. He wasn't just offering her a place to hide, he was offering her a throne in the middle of a war zone. He was giving her the power to strike back. "But you must understand the reality of this arrangement," Zuri, Ji-hoo warned softly, taking a slow step forward until he was towering over her, his broad shoulders blocking out the dim light of the library. "If you sign this, you are stepping entirely into my shadow. You will live in this estate. You will travel only with my security detail. You will become a permanent, highly visible fixture in a very dark, very dangerous world. It is a cage, Zuri, a gilded, impenetrable cage. And I will not force you into it." He was offering her the ultimate choice. The fearsome mafia boss was surrendering his absolute control, leaving his entire empire hanging in the balance, waiting for a woman to choose him freely. Zuri looked at the leather folder and then up into the deeply vulnerable, obsessive eyes of the man standing before her. She saw the sheer desperation he was trying to hide. He wasn't just trying to save her from federal prison, he was terrified of losing her. Zuri slowly reached out and picked up the heavy silver pen resting beside the folder. "I don't hide, Ji-hoo," Zuri murmured, her voice laced with an intoxicating, emotionally dominant fire. She opened the folder, her warm brown eyes never leaving his face. "If I am stepping into your shadow, it is not to be protected. It is to help you burn the traitors to the ground." With a swift, elegant motion, Zuri signed her name at the bottom of the contract. Ji-hoo let out a ragged, shuddering breath. The relief and sheer possessive pride that washed over his sharp features was staggering. He reached out, his large, warm hand gently covering hers as she dropped the pen. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, the slow burn romantic tension between them igniting into a brilliant, undeniable spark. "Welcome to the Empire, Madam Director," Ji-hoo whispered, the title falling from his lips like a dark, beautiful vow. By sunrise, the dynamic of the Ryu estate had permanently shifted. Zuri did not return to the mirrored executive desk. Instead, she took her place directly inside Ji-hoo's private, high-tech war room. She wore a breathtaking, tailored ivory pantsuit that perfectly complemented her melanin-rich skin, her braids pulled into a fierce, commanding crown. For hours, they worked in perfectly synced, high-stakes proximity. They traced the encrypted data streams, dismantling the board's hostile takeover, piece by piece. Every time Zuri leaned over the console, Jihu's eyes would linger on the soft curve of her neck. When he handed her a fresh cup of coffee, his fingers deliberately brushed against hers, lingering just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. The psychological tension was agonizing. They were two brilliant minds operating at the highest level of survival, completely hyper-aware of the magnetic, devastating pull between them. "I've isolated the source," Zuri announced at exactly 11:45 a.m., breaking the heavy silence of the war room. Her fingers flew across the illuminated keyboard as she finally cracked the deepest layer of the board's encryption. "I have the original digital authorization form. The exact terminal that initiated the embezzlement and planted my name on the accounts." Jihu immediately walked up behind her, his massive chest brushing against the back of her chair as he leaned over to look at the main monitor. "Who was it? Which board members signed the execution order?" Zuri stared at the screen, her blood running completely cold. Her hands began to tremble, the fierce, unshakable confidence draining entirely from her beautiful face. She clicked the decryption key, revealing the hidden digital signature. "Jihu," Zuri whispered, her voice cracking as sheer, unadulterated shock paralyzed her lungs. She looked up at the terrifying mafia boss, dropping a verbal grenade that shattered their entire reality. "It wasn't a board member. The terminal that framed me is registered to the man who vanished from my life 5 years ago. It's my father." The high-tech war room descended into a suffocating, absolute silence. The glow of the multi-monitor display cast a pale, icy light across Zuri's face as she stared at the decrypted digital signature. Marcus Washington. The name on the screen wasn't just a string of data. It was a ghost. It was the man who had taught her how to build her first firewall, the man who had kissed her forehead on her 18th birthday, and the man who had vanished without a single trace the very next morning, leaving her to fend for herself in a cold, unforgiving world. Zuri's hands began to shake. The fierce, untouchable executive director of intelligence was suddenly just a daughter staring at the ultimate betrayal. Her breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound that shattered the quiet of the room. She closed her eyes, trying to force the devastating reality back down, but the emotional dam was already cracking. Jihu didn't ask questions. He didn't demand an immediate tactical breakdown. The terrifying Iron Boss, a man who possessed the power to crush rival syndicates with a single phone call, immediately dropped his absolute authority to become her anchor. He stepped around the massive console, his large hands gently grasping the armrests of her sleek leather chair. He smoothly spun her away from the monitors, completely blocking her view of the screen with his broad, imposing frame. Then, right there in the center of his command center, the undisputed king of the Seoul underworld dropped to one knee. "Look at me, Zuri," Jihu commanded softly, his deep baritone vibrating with a profound, aching tenderness. Zuri opened her eyes, tears of pure, unadulterated shock brimming on her thick lashes. She looked down into his pitch-black, predatory eyes, finding absolutely nothing but a fierce, protective warmth. "He sold me out," Zuri whispered, her voice fracturing. "My own father. He vanished 5 years ago because of his gambling debts. I spent years paying off the loan sharks he left behind. I thought he was dead. And now, he's the architect of the board's ghost network. He used my social security number, my digital footprint. He framed me to take the fall for a multi-billion-won embezzlement." A dark, lethal shadow passed over Jihu's sharp, aristocratic features. It wasn't a violent, screaming rage. It was the terrifying, freezing wrath of a billionaire who was about to systematically dismantle a man's entire existence. "He did not frame you, Zuri," Jihu stated, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that carried the weight of absolute truth. He reached up, his calloused thumbs gently wiping a stray tear from her melanin-rich cheek. The slow burn romantic tension between them deepened into something incredibly raw and profound. "He tried to drown you. But I am the ocean now. And I will not let you sink." Jihu stood up to his full, towering height, pulling his encrypted satellite phone from his tailored ivory trousers. He didn't order his men to grab weapons. He didn't order a hit. He utilized the terrifying, invisible power of his wealth. "Connect me to the World Bank registry," Jihu ordered, his voice echoing in the cold room. "I want Marcus Washington digitally erased. I want every offshore account, every shell corporation, and every alias tied to his biometric data frozen immediately. Buy out all of his outstanding debts globally. As of this second, I own him. I want his location tracked and routed directly to my private server." He ended the call, slipping the phone away. He turned back to Zuri, offering his hand. "Come here," he murmured softly. Zuri stood up, her legs slightly unsteady. She didn't hesitate to step into his immediate personal space. Jihu wrapped his massive arms around her, pulling her curves flush against his solid, unyielding chest. He buried his face into her intricate African braids, inhaling deeply, providing her with a physical, protective sanctuary that grounded her racing mind. "We are going to find him," Jihu whispered against her hair, his embrace fiercely tight. "And he will answer to you." For 10 minutes they stood together in the quiet hum of the servers, drawing strength from their proximity. Zuri's brilliant mind slowly recalibrated, her emotional dominance returning as she absorbed the safety of his arms. Suddenly, the main terminal on the desk let out a sharp, piercing ping. Zuri pulled back, her warm brown eyes instantly sharpening with focus. She turned to the monitors. A massive red alert was flashing across the screen. "Your global financial lockdown worked," Zuri breathed out, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "You froze his access to the board's dark money. He's panicking. He's attempting to bypass the lockdown by pinging the Ryu Holdings mainframe directly to reroute the funds." "Trace the ping," Jihu ordered, stepping up right behind her, his chest brushing her shoulder. "I don't just have his location," Zuri said, a fierce, brilliant smile finally touching her lips as she executed a master-level decryption override. "I have his camera." With a final, devastating keystroke, Zuri hijacked the incoming signal. The main monitor flickered, the data streams vanishing to reveal a live, encrypted video feed. Sitting in a dimly lit, high-end server room halfway across the world was an older, exhausted-looking black man. His fingers were frozen over his keyboard, his eyes wide with sheer panic as he realized his private terminal had just been forcibly taken over. "Hello, Dad," Zuri said, her voice dropping the vulnerability entirely, replaced by a cold, intellectual steel. Marcus Washington recoiled from the screen, his face draining of color. Zuri, you shouldn't be on this network. You need to log off immediately before they trace you." "I am the one tracing you," Zuri fired back, crossing her arms over her chest, fully embracing her role as the director of intelligence. "You framed me for the board's coup. You left me with your debts 5 years ago, and now you're trying to hand me a federal prison sentence. Why?" "I didn't frame you," Marcus shouted desperately, leaning closer to his camera. "Zuri, you have to listen to me. I put the embezzled funds in your name because it was the only place the board couldn't legally touch it without triggering an international audit. I was trying to protect the money from him." Marcus pointed a shaking finger directly at the camera lens, looking past Zuri to the towering, broad-shouldered man standing directly behind her in the shadows. "Get away from him, Zuri," Marcus pleaded, his voice breaking with raw terror. "The board didn't hire me to execute a coup against Ryu Jihu. I went to the board to destroy him. Because 5 years ago, Ryu Jihu is the man who bought my gambling debts. And he is the man who put a gun to my head and forced me to abandon you." The live video feed crackled with static. Marcus Washington's panicked, echoing breaths filling the high-tech war room. The accusation hung in the freezing air like a physical blade. "He put a gun to my head and forced me to abandon you." Zuri did not gasp. She did not collapse into a puddle of tears, nor did she scream at the terrifying billionaire standing in the shadows behind her. Her brilliant mind, trained to detect anomalies in data, immediately detected the anomaly in her father's voice. It wasn't the sound of a man who had sacrificed everything for his daughter. It was the sound of a coward desperately trying to shift the blame. With a single, sharp keystroke, Zuri severed the connection. The massive monitor went entirely black. The suffocating silence returned to the war room, Zuri slowly spun her leather chair around to face Ryu Ji-hoo. The Iron Boss was standing completely still, his broad shoulders tense beneath his crisp white shirt. For the first time since she had walked into his boardroom, he looked genuinely, deeply terrified. He was waiting for her to look at him with hatred. He was waiting for the one woman who held his soul to condemn him as a monster. "Did you threaten him with a weapon, Ji-hoo?" Zuri asked, her voice perfectly level, devoid of hysteria but demanding absolute, unvarnished truth. Ji-hoo slowly closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling heavily. "No," he rumbled, the deep baritone stripped of all its corporate armor. "I don't use weapons, Zuri. I use ledgers. And your father's ledger was painted entirely in blood." He took a slow, deliberate step forward, needing to close the physical distance but stopping just short of her personal space, offering her the social power to pull away. "5 years ago, your father didn't just owe gambling debts," Ji-hoo confessed, his voice dropping to a gravelly, agonizing whisper. "He owed 3 billion won to the Cheonggyecheon loan sharks. They are not men who deal in corporate sabotage, they deal in human collateral. When Marcus couldn't pay, they demanded you." Zuri's breath hitched, a sudden, icy chill sweeping over her skin. "I found out through my intelligence network," Ji-hoo continued, his pitch-black eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, burning intensity. "I bought his debt within the hour. I brought him to my office. I didn't hold a gun to his head, Zuri. I handed him a contract. I told him I would clear his debts and let him live. On one non-negotiable condition, he had to leave the country and never contact you again. Because he was an addict, and if he stayed, he would have eventually dragged you down into the dark with him." The pieces of the past 5 years rapidly, violently snapped together in Zuri's mind. The anonymous full-ride scholarship to the elite tech academy that arrived 3 days after her father vanished. The perfectly timed fast-track hiring process at Ryu Holdings right after she graduated. The invisible, impenetrable shield that had seemingly guarded her entire adult life. "You didn't just buy out his debt," Zuri whispered, her warm brown eyes wide with a staggering, overwhelming realization. She stood up from her chair, entirely ignoring the space he had given her, and stepped directly into his chest. "You've been watching over me for 5 years. I have been entirely consumed by you for 5 years, Ji-hoo corrected, the raw honesty fracturing his voice. The slow burn romantic tension that had been simmering between them finally reached a devastating peak. Ji-hoo couldn't hold back anymore. He reached out, his large, calloused hands gently framing her face. His thumbs softly traced the high arches of her cheekbones, his touch carrying an agonizing reverence, as if he were holding the most precious, fragile artifact in the world. "I built this empire. I cultivated a reputation of absolute terror, just to ensure that the monsters of this city would never look in your direction," Ji-hoo murmured, leaning his forehead against hers. His breath ghosted over her lips, warm and intoxicating with the scent of cedarwood and amber. "You were never just a data analyst to me, Zuri. You were my gravity." Zuri closed her eyes, leaning into his solid warmth. The psychological support he offered wasn't just protective, it was profoundly empowering. He hadn't controlled her life, he had silently cleared the battlefield so her brilliance could thrive. She lifted her hands, her fingers weaving gently into his dark, perfectly styled hair, providing the fearsome mafia boss with the one thing he had lacked for 32 years. Absolute, unconditional acceptance. "Then let's finish clearing the battlefield," Zuri whispered fiercely, her emotional dominance returning with a vengeance. She opened her eyes, blazing with an intellectual fire. "My father thought he was trapping me by putting the board's embezzled billions in my name. But he didn't realize he just gave me the absolute legal authority over their capital." Ji-hoo pulled back slightly, a dark, incredibly proud smirk touching his lips as he watched his queen calculate her next move. "What are you going to do, Madam Director?" "I am going to initiate a hostile buyback," Zuri declared, spinning back to the main terminal. Her intricate braids swayed as she began typing at a blistering pace. "I am going to use their own stolen funds to aggressively purchase all of their controlling shares on the dark market. By 8 a.m. tomorrow, the traders won't just be fired. I will legally own them. For the next hour, The war room hummed with electric, addictive synergy. They operated as a flawless unit. When Zuri hit an encryption wall, Jihu provided the offshore routing numbers. When she needed to bypass a federal server, she did it with a strawberry lollipop in her mouth, while Jihu stood behind her, his hand resting heavily and warmly on her shoulder, completely anchoring her to the present. The proximity was intoxicating. Every accidental brush of their hands, every shared, intense glance reflected in the monitor screens, solidified a bond that no corporate coup could ever break. Almost there, Zuri breathed out, her eyes flying across the final line of code. The shares are secured. The funds are routed. I just need to execute the final transfer to officially hand the board's equity back to Ryu Holdings. She pressed the execution key. Instead of the green confirmation screen, a massive flashing gold crest appeared on the monitor. A digital lock. Zuri frowned, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Wait, the system is blocking the transfer back to your company. It's triggering an archaic corporate firewall. It says the execution of this specific magnitude of shares requires a dual signature. She turned her head to look up at him, deep confusion in her eyes. It requires the biometric authorization of a legally recognized spouse to transfer the assets. Jihu didn't look surprised. His dark eyes burned with a terrifying, absolute possessiveness as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the heavy leather folder she had signed hours earlier in the library. I know, Jihu purred smoothly, dropping a verbal grenade that completely stopped the air in Zuri's lungs. Because the corporate immunity contract you signed 2 hours ago to save your life was also our legally binding marriage certificate. The words echoed in the freezing air of the war room, heavy and catastrophic. Legally binding marriage certificate. Zuri stared at the heavy leather folder resting on the console, her brilliant mind screeching to a devastating halt. The intoxicating warmth that had enveloped her just seconds ago vanished, replaced by an icy, suffocating wave of betrayal. She slowly pulled away from Jihu's solid chest, stepping back until her spine hit the edge of the mahogany desk. You tricked me, Zuri whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a profound, rising fury. You handed me a document in the dark, told me it was a corporate immunity shield, and bound me to you legally without my consent. Jihu didn't flinch. The raw vulnerability he had shown mere moments ago was instantly swallowed by the terrifying, impenetrable mask of the Iron Boss. He stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, absorbing her anger with cold, calculating precision. I forged an absolute legal shield, Jihu corrected, his deep baritone completely stripped of its previous tenderness, vibrating with strict, unyielding authority. In South Korean law, the spouse of a syndicate head possesses ultimate spousal privilege. Federal prosecutors cannot legally compel you to testify, and they cannot seize assets jointly held by a legally wedded wife without a Supreme Court mandate. It was the only airtight defense against the board's frame-up. I did what was necessary to secure your survival. You did what was necessary to secure me. Zuri fired back, her emotional dominance flaring as she refused to be intimidated by his corporate logic. Her warm brown eyes blazed with a fierce, unbroken fire. You didn't ask me, Jihu. You didn't offer me a partnership. You operated just like the men you claimed to protect me from. My father sold me to clear a debt. You manipulated me into a marriage to clear a firewall. You aren't any different. You just wear a more expensive suit. The word struck him like a physical blow. A microscopic flinch, a tightening of his jaw, a brief, agonizing flash of pain in his pitch-black eyes betrayed the damage her statement caused. But Ryu Jihu was a man who had spent 32 years burying his pain. He hardened his features, accepting her hatred if it meant she was safe. Think what you must, Zuri, Jihu stated coldly, walking toward the main terminal. But the trap the board set for you is still active. The federal prosecutors will raid your apartment in exactly 20 minutes. Place your hand on the biometric scanner. Execute the transfer. As my wife, the billions will instantly merge into my untouchable private estate, and the board's leverage will completely disintegrate. Zuri crossed her arms, her intricate African braids falling over her shoulders as she stared him down. And what if I refuse? What if I refuse to validate a marriage built on a lie? Jihu stopped. He turned his head slowly, looking at her with a terrifying, absolute darkness. You will not refuse. Because if you do, the system will lock you out, the feds will arrest you, and I will be forced to burn half of Seoul to the ground to get you out of federal custody. I am not losing you, Zuri. Scan your hand. The psychological tension in the room snapped. It was no longer a romance. It was a brutal, high-stakes collision of two dominant minds. Zuri stepped up to the console. She didn't look at the glowing green biometric scanner. Instead, her sharp eyes darted to the secondary monitor, the one displaying the system logs of Jihu's private server. Her genius-level intellect instantly caught a glaring anomaly in the code architecture. A timestamp. She froze, her blood running completely cold. You knew. Zuri breathed out, sheer disbelief fracturing her voice. She pointed a shaking finger at the system log. This decryption key, the master override for the board's ghost network, it wasn't generated tonight. It was generated 3 days ago. On your personal terminal. Jihu remained perfectly silent, his jaw locked tight. You knew about the board's coup days before I even walked into your boardroom, Zuri continued, her mind rapidly deconstructing the ultimate betrayal. You already had the power to stop them. You didn't need my firewall. You didn't need my intellect to save your empire. She looked up at him, tears of pure, shattering heartbreak finally spilling over her lashes. You let the coup escalate. You let my father frame me. You let the federal warrant activate, just so I would be pushed into a corner so desperate, so terrifying, that I would have absolutely no choice but to run to you. You didn't save me from the maze, Jihu. You built the maze that led me directly into your cage. The silence that followed was deafening. Jihu did not deny it. He couldn't. He looked at the brilliant, beautiful woman he loved, fully aware that his terrifying need to possess and protect her had just destroyed her trust completely. You are an anomaly I could not predict, Zuri, Jihu murmured, his voice a low, gravelly confession. You were completely independent. Unreachable. If I approached you normally, you would have walked away. So I removed every other path. I orchestrated the board's failure to ensure your permanent residence in my world. I am a monster, Zuri. I never claimed to be otherwise. But you are mine, and you are safe. I am not a corporate asset you can acquire, Zuri whispered, her voice dripping with absolute, lethal calm. She didn't place her hand on the biometric scanner to authorize the transfer. Instead, her fingers flew across the keyboard with blinding speed. She was the director of intelligence, and for the last 4 hours, she had completely rewritten the security architecture of the Ryu estate. What are you doing? Jihu demanded, stepping forward, his eyes widening as a massive, red warning klaxon began to sound throughout the war room. You wanted me to be your legally wedded wife, Mr. Ryu? Zuri asked, stepping back from the console as the heavy steel blast doors of the war room suddenly slammed shut, locking Jihu inside. Congratulations, under South Korean corporate law, as your spouse, I hold 50% of your voting power. And I just used it to initiate a total management lockout. Jihu slammed his hands against the reinforced glass, his eyes blazing with a mixture of absolute shock and terrifying awe as he stared at her through the barrier. Zuri picked up her lavender blazer, slipping it on over her ivory suit. She looked at the fearsome king of the underworld, delivering a verbal grenade that shattered his entire reality. I don't need your protection from the board, husband, Zuri said, her voice echoing through the intercom. Because I just transferred the embezzled billions into a completely untraceable offshore account, and I am going to deal with my father myself. For 72 hours, the sprawling metropolis of Seoul became a massive, high-stakes chessboard, and Zuri Washington was entirely in control of the game. Using the untraceable offshore accounts she had hijacked, Zuri vanished into the city's dense digital landscape. She secured an ultra-exclusive, anonymous penthouse suite under a ghost alias, transforming the luxurious living room into a state-of-the-art, impenetrable command center. She had successfully outmaneuvered the most terrifying syndicate boss in Asia, locked him in his own fortress, and claimed absolute independence. She had the money, She had the power, and she had the freedom. But the victory tasted entirely like ash. The silence of the penthouse was deafening. Without the heavy, comforting scent of cedarwood and amber, the air felt thin and cold. Every time Zuri successfully decrypted a new layer of her father's dark web trail, she instinctively turned her head, expecting to see Ji-Hu's broad shoulders leaning against the console, his pitch-black eyes watching her with that agonizing, proud reverence. She missed the devastating weight of his presence. She missed the way his massive hand felt resting protectively on her shoulder. Her brilliant, analytical mind had won the war, but her heart was enduring a brutal, suffocating withdrawal. Across the city, the Ryu estate had become a freezing, terrifying tomb. Ji-Hu had bypassed the war room's lockdown. Within 20 minutes he was the architect of the fortress, after all. His elite security detail had immediately mobilized, heavily armed and waiting for the order to tear Seoul apart to find his runaway queen. But the Iron Boss had issued a command that sent shockwaves through the entire underworld. Stand down. For 3 days, Ji-Hu did not leave the war room. The immaculate, terrifying corporate monarch was completely unspooled. He discarded his expensive suit jackets, pacing the floor in a wrinkled white shirt, his eyes shadowed with a profound, consuming exhaustion. He didn't unleash his wrath on the city, because he knew exactly why she had left. He had tried to cage an eagle to protect it from a storm, completely failing to realize that her wings were meant to conquer the sky. Instead of hunting her physically, a silent, agonizingly intimate digital Cold War began between them. Ji-Hu knew Zuri was watching his mainframe. She couldn't help herself. So, he used his empire to send her a message. Over the course of 48 hours, Zuri watched through her encrypted monitors as Ji-Hu ruthlessly, systematically annihilated the board members who had conspired against them. It was a bloodless, terrifying display of absolute corporate slaughter. He froze their assets, exposed their private scandals to the global press, and legally stripped them of their legacies. He was burning his own boardroom to the ground, leaving massive digital breadcrumbs for Zuri to follow. It wasn't a display of intimidation. It was a desperate, multi-billion-won love letter. He was clearing the battlefield just like he promised, proving that he would destroy his own kingdom before he ever let it threaten her again. Zuri watched the final board member's resignation flash across her screen at 2:00 a.m. on the third night. A rogue tear slipped down her cheek. The emotional fallout was shattering them both. She placed her hands flat against her desk, taking a deep, shuddering breath. She had to finish this. Refocusing her brilliant mind, she executed the final tracking algorithm on her father's encrypted server ping. The code rippled across the massive monitor, finally locking on to a physical GPS coordinate. Macau, the Grand Lisboa VIP Suites. Zuri's eyes hardened with fierce, unshakable resolve. She reached for her encrypted phone to charter a private ghost flight. She was going to face the man who had sold her out, and she was going to do it alone. Suddenly, her entire workstation completely froze. The glowing lines of data vanished. The keyboard locked out. Zuri's heart hammered violently against her ribs. No one in the world possessed the processing power to bypass the firewall she had spent 3 days building. No one, except the man who owned the telecommunications satellite she was routing her signal through. The main monitor flickered, cutting to a high-definition, live video feed. Ryu Ji-Hu appeared on the screen. The breath was completely knocked out of Zuri's lungs. He looked devastated. The cold, impenetrable mask of the Iron Boss was entirely gone, leaving behind a man who was drowning in the agonizing absence of the only woman he had ever loved. He was sitting at his desk in the Ryu estate, staring directly into the camera as if he could see straight into her soul. "I know you found him, Zuri," Ji-Hu's deep, rumbling baritone echoed through the quiet penthouse, sending a devastating jolt of longing straight down her spine. "I know Marcus is in Macau." Zuri stepped closer to the screen, her emotional dominance wavering as she drank in the sight of his face. She unmuted her microphone. "You promised you wouldn't hunt me, Ji-Hu." "I am not hunting you, Madam Director," Ji-Hu whispered, his voice cracking with a raw, unprotected vulnerability that completely melted her remaining defenses. "I am surrendering to you." He leaned forward, his dark eyes swirling with absolute terrifying devotion. You were right. I built a maze to trap you, because I was too much of a coward to believe that a woman of your brilliance could ever choose a monster of her own free will. You wanted independence, Zuri, so I am giving it to you. Zuri frowned, a sudden, icy knot of panic tightening in her stomach. What are you talking about? I am not sending my syndicate to Macau to retrieve your father, Jihu stated calmly, dropping a verbal grenade that shattered the entire foundation of the Cold War. And you do not have to fly there to confront him. Because 5 minutes ago, I handed over my encrypted ledgers to the federal prosecutor's office. Zuri's blood ran completely cold. Jihu, no, the board's embezzlement, the ghost accounts, the international data breaches, Jihu continued, a soft, heartbreakingly proud smile touching his lips. I legally confess to all of it, Zuri. The warrants for your father are nullified. The target on your back is gone. They are coming to the estate to arrest me right now, and as my legally wedded wife, you officially own the entirety of Ryu Holdings. The live video feed from the Ryu Estate war room captured the faint, terrifying wail of federal sirens echoing in the distance. Jihu sat calmly at his desk, the Iron Boss entirely at peace with his destruction. He reached up, ready to sever the connection and walk out to surrender himself to the authorities. He was sacrificing his empire, his freedom, and his entire life to ensure Zuri and her father would never spend a day in a courtroom. Don't you dare touch that screen, Ryu Jihu. Zuri's voice sliced through the audio feed, sharp, lethal, and ringing with absolute emotional dominance. Jihu's hand froze mid-air. He looked back at the camera, a flash of desperate panic breaking his calm facade. Zuri, log off. If they trace your IP when they breach my servers, I am not logging off, and you are not surrendering to anyone. Zuri fired back, her warm brown eyes blazing with a fierce, blinding intellectual fire. Her fingers flew across her keyboard with terrifying speed, executing a series of commands she had pre-written hours ago. You think you can just unilaterally fall on your sword? You think I outmaneuvered a hostile corporate board and hijacked 3 billion won just to let you play the tragic martyr? You don't know who you married. Zuri, the warrants are signed. Jihu shouted, standing up from his desk, his massive frame radiating terrified urgency. The prosecutors are in the lower lobby right now. Let them come, Zuri stated coldly. With a final, devastating keystroke, she executed her master protocol. The heavy steel blast doors of the Ryu Estate war room hissed loudly. Jihu spun around as the security lock disengaged. The doors slid open, but it wasn't the federal agents standing on the other side. It was Zuri. She stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, her intricate African braids slightly windblown from the high-speed helicopter charter that had rushed her back from her ghost penthouse. She wore her sharp ivory suit, her posture flawless and utterly unshakable. She had walked right past the heavily armed federal raid in the lobby, using her absolute clearance as the legal owner of Ryu Holdings. Jihu stared at her in sheer, paralyzed disbelief. The terrifying syndicate king was completely disarmed. Why did you come back? I gave you the empire. I gave you your freedom. I don't want an empty empire. Zuri shouted, stepping into the room and closing the blast doors behind her, sealing them inside. She didn't use a weapon. She didn't raise a fist. She walked directly up to the most dangerous man in Seoul and slammed both of her hands flat against his chest, backing him directly into the edge of the mahogany console. You promised me a partnership in the library, Jihu, Zuri cried out, her voice fracturing with raw, profound honesty. The tears she had been holding back for 3 days finally spilled over her cheeks. You told me I was your gravity. And then you tried to throw yourself into the void to protect me. I am not a fragile thing you need to lock away to keep safe. I am your equal. Jihu's breath hitched. He looked down at the brilliant, beautiful woman pressing against him. The crushing weight of the last 3 days broke him entirely. He reached out, his massive hands wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against his solid body as if he were physically starving for her warmth. I couldn't let them take you, Zuri, Jihu whispered fiercely, burying his face into the soft curve of her neck. He was trembling, the invincible Iron Boss, completely stripped of his armor, shaking in the arms of the woman he loved. I would burn 1,000 empires before I let you spend a single night in a cell. I am nothing without you. Zuri softened completely. The Cold War was over. The agonizing withdrawal vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, brilliant rush of pure devotion. She wrapped her arms around his broad, muscular shoulders, holding him with a fierce, protective strength that equaled his own. You don't have to burn anything, Zuri murmured, her voice a soothing, intoxicating caress against his ear. She slowly pulled back, framing his devastatingly handsome face with her warm, calloused hands. She looked directly into his dark, obsessive eyes. Listen to me, Ji-hoo. The federal agents downstairs, they aren't here to arrest you. Ji-hoo frowned, profound confusion crossing his sharp features. I filed a digital confession. I claimed sole responsibility for the embezzled dark money. I know, Zuri smiled, a brilliant, wildly dangerous smirk touching her lips. But I deleted your confession from the federal server before they could read it. Ji-hoo stared at her. Then why are they here? Because 3 hours ago, I took the $3 billion the board embezzled, and I legally transferred it into a highly publicized, federally protected charitable trust, Zuri explained, her intellect shining like a beacon. I used the blueprints you showed me in the library. I fully funded the Smart City Infrastructure project for the lower districts, and I registered the entire foundation under your name. Ji-hoo's heart stopped. The money isn't dark anymore, Ji-hoo. It's public, Zuri whispered, her thumbs gently stroking his cheekbones. You didn't embezzle corporate funds. According to the data trail I just hardwired into the World Bank, you executed the largest private philanthropic donation in South Korean history. The federal agents downstairs aren't here to serve an arrest warrant. They are waiting in the lobby with the mayor of Seoul to present you with a civilian medal of honor. The realization washed over Ji-hoo like a tidal wave. She hadn't just saved his life. She hadn't just outsmarted the government. She had taken the deepest, most vulnerable secret he harbored, his desire to build a better city. His hidden garden, and she had forced the world to protect it. She had completely rewritten his legacy from a terrifying monster to an untouchable savior. The massive, impenetrable wall around Ryu Ji-hoo's soul finally, completely melted. He let out a ragged, breathless sound, capturing her lips in a devastating, all-consuming kiss. There was no hesitation, no holding back. It was a kiss built on deep psychological trust, absolute awe, and raw, unrestrained passion. He kissed her like she had just breathed oxygen back into his dead lungs. Zuri melted against him, her fingers weaving into his dark hair, entirely surrendering to the slow-burn romance that had finally ignited into a roaring fire. When they finally pulled apart, completely breathless, Ji-hoo rested his forehead against hers. You are a terrifying woman, Madam Director, Ji-hoo whispered, a dark, brilliant smile finally reaching his eyes. And you are my husband, Zuri replied softly, sealing the truth of their bond once and for all. Now, fix your time, Mr. Ryu. The mayor is waiting. The heavy steel blast doors of the war room slid open, revealing the grand, marble-lined corridor of the Ryu estate. Through the panoramic windows at the end of the hall, the flashing lights of the city's elite security escorts illuminated the night, waiting to guide Seoul's newest and most unexpected philanthropic hero to the global press gala. Ryu Ji-hoo paused just before the threshold. He turned to Zuri, his pitch-black eyes reflecting a profound, unshakable calm that the world had never seen on the face of the Iron Boss. He reached up, his large, calloused fingers gently adjusting the collar of his shirt, but his gaze never left her face. For 32 years, Ji-hoo had believed that true power was a solitary fortress built on a foundation of absolute terror, crushing leverage, and suffocating silence. He had believed that to protect what was valuable, you had to bury it in the dark where the monsters of the underworld could never find it. But as he looked at the brilliant, beautiful woman standing before him, her intricate African braids pulled into a commanding crown, her eyes blazing with an intellectual dominance that had completely rewritten his destiny, he finally understood the true meaning of power. True power wasn't the ability to make the world tremble in fear. It wasn't about hoarding billions or building an impenetrable cage to lock away what you loved. Power was the ultimate vulnerability. It was the absolute courage to let the right person into your fortress, to dismantle your own armor, and to trust a brilliant mind to fight by your side. It was a legacy built not on isolated tyranny, but on fierce, unbreakable loyalty. Zuri stepped into his space, her small hands sliding up his broad chest to perfectly straighten his silk tie. She offered him a soft, devastatingly confident smile that sent a wave of pure adoration straight through his chest. "You look like a savior, Mr. Ryu," Zuri murmured, her voice carrying that addictive, emotionally dominant edge that completely captivated his soul. "I am merely a man who was smart enough to marry his mastermind," Madam Director Jihu replied, his deep, rumbling baritone laced with an intense, possessive warmth. He leaned down, pressing a tender, lingering kiss to her forehead, a silent vow of eternal protection. "The board is dismantled. The empire is legally yours. And for the first time in my life, the shadows are empty." Zuri smiled, looping her arm through his, as they prepared to take their first step out into the blinding lights of the media world together. Their victory was absolute. They had beaten the corporate coup, cleared her father's name, and forced the entire city to protect their hidden garden. They were untouchable. Suddenly, every single monitor in the high-tech war room behind them violently flickered. The calm, rhythmic hum of the servers transformed into a sharp, piercing, and deafening electronic screech. Zuri's smile vanished instantly. Her posture snapped completely rigid as her brilliant, analytical mind detected the impossible. Her ultimate master-level security firewall, the one she had just used to override the federal government, was being aggressively, effortlessly ripped apart from the outside. Jihu's grip on her arm tightened, his sharp aristocratic features instantly hardening back into the cold, lethal mask of the Iron Boss. "Zuri," Jihu whispered, his voice dangerously low. "What is that?" "I don't know," Zuri breathed out, her blood running completely cold as she stared back into the war room. "Nothing can bypass this terminal. Nothing on Earth has the processing power to decode my encryption this fast." The main, massive monitor went entirely pitch black. Then, slowly, a cold, glowing silver crest materialized on the screen. It wasn't the corporate logo of Ryu Holdings, and it wasn't the digital signature of the board. It was an ancient, terrifying symbol of a dual-headed dragon, wrapping around a broken crown the ultra-secret Global Shadow Syndicate that sat entirely above the South Korean mafia. The screen cut to a live, unencrypted video feed, and the breath was completely knocked out of Zuri's lungs. The camera was broadcasting from a dark, heavily reinforced underground bunker in Macau. Bound tightly to a heavy steel chair in the center of the room was Marcus Washington. Her father was covered in sweat, his eyes wide with a manic, hyperventilating terror as he stared directly into the lens. "Zuri. Ji-hoo. If you can hear me, run." Marcus screamed desperately, his voice cracking with a raw horror that chilled them to the bone. "The board didn't plan the coup. They were just the distraction. He used my name to lure you two together. He wanted you to get married." It was all part of his before Marcus could finish the sentence. A large, heavy hand, gloved in black leather, reached into the frame and brutally slammed a piece of heavy duct tape over his mouth, cutting off his warnings into suffocating, muffled sobs. The camera slowly panned upward, tracking the smooth, terrifyingly calm movements of a tall, broad-shouldered man standing in the shadows behind her father. He wore a flawless, custom white suit that directly mirrored Jihu's silhouette. As the man stepped forward into the dim light, the absolute silence in the war room became deafening. He had the exact same sharp, aristocratic jawline as Jihu. He possessed the exact same piercing, predatory pitch-black eyes. A slow, chillingly familiar, and utterly wicked smirk spread across the stranger's face as he looked directly through the lens, staring straight into Jihu's soul. "You handled the corporate board beautifully. Little brother," the man spoke, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that echoed with a terrifying, absolute authority that made Jihu's entire body go completely rigid with shock. And your new wife is truly a digital genius. But did you really think I would let a Gen Z girl from America inherit my throne? The man in the white suit leaned down, bringing his face mere inches from the camera, his eyes burning with a lethal, obsessive promise that shattered their entire reality. The corporate game is over, Ji-hoo, he whispered smoothly, delivering a devastating verbal grenade that left the future of the entire empire hanging by a thread. The true king of the Ryu Syndicate has just returned from the dead. And I am coming to take back what is mine. The massive video feed instantly severed with a deafening electronic snap, plunging the main monitors into absolute deadness and throwing the war room back into an icy, suffocating darkness. Zuri and Ji-hoo stood frozen in the shadows, the thick silence of the room swallowing their ragged breaths. Outside the reinforced glass, the distant, frantic wail of the sirens still pierced the night, but the sound no longer signaled a victory march for Seoul's new savior. It sounded like the opening drums of a completely new, terrifying war. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, and always remember, in Annie's empire, love is the only law worth breaking. See you in the next story.